Hey folks, it's Finn. I want to make a quick video really about something I did on Friday. Now, if you follow me on the Finn fam, you'll know what that is. Basically, I went to Manchester to a conference on diversity in health and wellness. And I was there to talk about my experience of being a transgender male in recovery. If you follow me on here, you'll know that I entered recovery first, and then about a year into recovery, I came out as trans. And I've been really, really lucky to be accepted in my AA community, both in Oxford and in Devon. And, you know, with the support of the fellowship, I've not only got sober, but it's also supported me through all of the transition and all the stuff that would normally make me drink, I managed to deal with because of the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. So now, one of my passions whenever I get the chance is to speak about recovery and specifically speak about what it is like to be transgender in recovery. I've done a bit of work with Lifeline Project before. Dee Dee Wallace is just absolutely amazing. She's so full of energy and so passionate about making sure that all the diverse communities are reached and made sure that everybody can access recovery or health and wellness regardless of their background or circumstances. So it's wonderful to be working with her again. So she rang me and just asked me if I'd come and do a little presentation about my story and what it was for me to come out in AA, and just about some ideas around why transgender people have trouble accessing recovery, because they do. You know, I've got lots of friends who are transgender and have issues with alcohol, drugs, self-harm, all of these things. And most people speak about not being comfortable to access recovery, and then when they do access recovery, they don't feel they are welcomed in recovery. So in terms of speaking a little bit about recovery from drugs and alcohol, I talked about some of the barriers that I think are there. And the main barrier, really, I think, is because when people set up programs in health and wellness, they set up LGBT spaces and groups and what have you. But most of the time, which is quite common, is we have LGB and the T kind of falls off the end. Now, it's not one size fits all. I mean, the thing is, we're very different. Trans people are very different to the rest of the community. Yes, we have similar needs, which is why we are all together in the LGBT. But when it comes to health and wellness, we've got very, very different needs, which can really get in the way of us accessing recovery. The biggest one is the fact that gender and sexuality are separate, right? Completely separate entities. They cross over, but they are separate. So for us, in terms of accessing a group, our gender is a big issue. Things like pronouns are just hugely triggering. The gender dysphoria is real and awful. And on top of addiction issues as well, it's just awful, awful, awful to deal with. So if you're walking into a group or a recovery space or a health and wellness place and your pronouns aren't respected, if you've got to keep explaining yourself that you need these pronouns used for you, it's just exhausting. And of course doesn't make us very comfortable or willing to enter spaces. It was horrible for me in early days. I know people were trying their best, but people were still getting my pronouns wrong. And so this is something that really needs to be on the forefront of people's minds, both recovery workers and people in recovery services in general, to think about the impact of gender on people. The other thing, of course, is gendered spaces and gendered activities. In AA, it was you've got to have a male sponsor if you're male and a female sponsor if you're female, and that was really awkward for me in the early days. You also get male and female groups, which is hugely awkward, you know, in early days. I remember this at uni. This is completely off topic, but off uni, we were asked to stand up, and we were asked all the men to stand up and then all the women to stand up. And at the time, I was presenting as male but still looking very female. And the dysphoria in that was just horrible. And this happens in a lot of recovery centres. You know, you'll have male and female groups in dorms. You'll have male and female dorms. And then, of course, you've got showers and toilets. And all of this is a nightmare for us trans people, especially in early recovery. And especially for non-binary people who don't want to go in either of those spaces. You know, not either of those spaces speak to them. So we've got to be really careful when it comes to health and wellness services and spaces, that gender is really thought about in the way it impacts. You know, one of the biggest things I mentioned was toilets. And this was awful for me when I very first came out. Toilets are horrible. We all know, as trans people, toilets are the bane of our lives. When I first came out, going to meetings was hugely anxiety provoking. My anxiety had gone down in recovery, and then when coming out, it had gone up again because I was so anxious about toilets. And, you know, I'd come out to people as male, so I was going in male toilets, but in AA I felt really awkward because these are the people I'd been socialising with for a year, and now suddenly I was in the same toilet as the men. It's just awkward, and all the meetings that had unisex toilets or just cubicles was just a blessing, and I kind of gravitated towards those because all the issues around craving for a drink and wanting to use, I didn't want that added to by worrying about what bloody toilet I was going to have to use. You know, so I spoke about all of these kind of barriers to recovery and things to think about and the fears we have about being welcomed. And I really only had a short amount of time. I was told 15 to 20 minutes, so I really only scratched the surface of it. And I was so amazed at the reception I got. I was absolutely bowled over, actually. And actually what surprised me more than anything was people coming up to me afterwards and saying how much they didn't realise that we were different in terms of our needs, the transgender people and the LGBT community. That people hadn't thought about gendered spaces and toilets and rooms and all of that. And this shocks me. I guess for me, and for us trans people, this is just so normal to think about that we forget that most other people don't. So, you know, big up to everybody that was brave enough to come up and talk to me, because I know it's scary. And this is the biggest thing where people were saying was so scared of saying stuff for fear of upsetting you. So this is the issue, isn't it? We need dialogue with recovery services, but recovery services are scared to talk to us for fear of upsetting us. So we got this kind of like stuck in the middle bit here. You know, I don't know what the answer is totally, but what I do know is that we need a dialogue. I mean, it was clear yesterday in so many of the presentations that were talking about LGBT, we were left out. We weren't mentioned in any of them. And I'm not saying this as a criticism, because I think the fact that LGBT is on the table, it's great. It's just that now people need to think a bit more, because when they were talking about stats yesterday, there was one chap who was talking about the use of drugs in the LGBT community, and the stats were lesbians use this, gay men use that. Not once was the trans people mentioned. And again, this isn't a criticism. I think a lot of it is due to two things, really. There isn't that many stats around use specifically of the trans community of drugs and alcohol and self-harm and all this other stuff that needs looking at. And I think there's fear from trans people that if we go and use recovery services and news of that gets back to our gender clinic, that then we risk our gender services being taken away. So it worries me, because I know from being in the community I'm in that there are loads of transgender people out there that have got issues with drugs, alcohol, self-harm, eating disorders, all of this, and there aren't services tailored to help us. It was a really wonderful day to be talking about diversity, and it was just so inspiring. And as I say, none of this that I'm saying is to criticise any failings from leaving us out, because I think it is a work in progress. And I think if we criticise, that's just going to add to the stalemate. We need trans people to come forward and just be a bit more forward about what they want. I would really love it if people out there who are in recovery or people who have issues with anything at all could leave comments about, do you access services? Which ones do you use? Why do they work for you? If you don't access services, why don't you? What doesn't work for you? Let's have a conversation. Let's get gender on the agenda. I love that, right? Hashtag gender on the agenda. Let's start tweeting about this. Let's start talking about this. We all deserve recovery, wellness and health. I feel so blessed to have the recovery I have. And actually, I think everybody in AA is really accepting. I think a lot of time fear stops us from accessing these groups where actually we would be okay. But anyway, I am blessed, and I just want everybody else to be able to access that recovery as well. So please do talk to me about your experiences, and let's get talking and see what we can do to make this different, because it isn't rocket science. All that would need to be done was to be just a bit more thoughtful about gender, about gendered spaces, and just talking to us, really. Just talking to us. Don't lump us together with the LGBT community. Think about us specifically in what differs for us and what might help us. That was a bit of a rant, wasn't it? I only came on here to say how it went, and I went off on one. But, you know, this is something I'm very passionate about, so let's talk about it. Right, folks, I will see you next week for some new vlogs. So watch this space. Bye-bye.